Hi, this is Philosophy81, and today we start talking about the religions of China and Japan. We haven't talked about China that much, or Japan. We've really only mentioned them insofar as we've talked about the spread of the Indian religions, for example, Buddhism, into China and what happened then. Buddhism entered into China via the trade routes around the 1st century of the Common Era. But there were already religions in place. We had, namely, in China, Confucianism and Taoism. So these are two indigenous religions from China. Both are claimed to have been started around 550 BCE. And they are slightly different, but they have some things in common. So Confucianism puts the family and the state and the orderliness of those things first. It is a social political ideology that says, look, if we get our homes, our family, our government in order, we will have harmony and order. We'll have peace. Taoism almost takes the opposite attack. They put nature first and the cosmic order and yourself first. So they say society is kind of unnatural, that we need to be spontaneous and not follow the rules. And if we do that and ignore these rules that are human made, we'll find the harmony and order. Both are trying to find peace, find order, find a way to get in harmony with heaven. Heaven is not a place in the Chinese religions. It is a force. So there is a cosmic force of heaven called Tian in Chinese. The cosmic force runs through everything. And the problems that we have in the world come from us not being in sync with heaven. So Confucianism tries one way to sync up with heaven. Taoism tries another way. As far as the Buddhist ideas coming into China, well, some of the ideas were adopted, but the Buddhist ideas on rebirth and samsara, the rebirth cycle, conflicted with Confucian ideas on what's called filial piety, which we'll talk about in a minute. And that there were problems with this because the ancestors might be reborn as a dog or whatever, and that you would lose the help your ancestors gave you from their being in heaven and having some authority. Also, if you became a monk or nun and were celibate, you would not have children who would take care of you after you died. So there was some conflict, but a lot of the ideas did mesh okay. So we need to look first at some of the dynasties in China. Let's see. Oops. Yeah, there we go. So we have the Shay Kingdom, the Shang Dynasty, the Zhou Dynasty, the Warring States period, and the Qin Dynasty. There are other dynasties, of course, that come after that, but we're not going to be concerned about them. We're only concerned about these because of what they contribute to the religion and the development and changes within the religion. So the Shay Kingdom, the very first one, it's credited to being or having existed around 2,000 years BCE, but it's more legendary than factual. It's legendary in the sense that we don't have any real data going back to identify or to show that any of the kings that the Emperor Yu and the others that allegedly lived during this time actually did live. However, the legends or the stories about the Shay Kingdom talk about China and this kingdom as being a glorious place. It was like the most wonderful, streets are running with milk and honey and paved with gold and so forth. Everybody is happy, everybody is well fed and taken care of, everything is in order and it's good. So it's looked upon as that's what we would try to recreate, or that's what we want to recreate. We move from the legendary Xie Kingdom into the Shang Dynasty. Now we actually have evidence of the Shang Dynasty and all of the other subsequent dynasties. So the Shang Dynasty began in about 1500 BCE. It saw its ruler as Shangdi, the supreme ruler, so that's why it's called the Shang Dynasty. And he is one of the most important, or the most important deity during that period. He is considered to be the ancestor of the ruling family. So during the 500 or so years that the Shang Dynasty was in power, the family name or the family power was passed from child to child to child. So one of the ideas that comes up in the Shang Dynasty is the term filial piety. So filial piety, and hopefully you have your vocabulary list there in front of you so you can see the spelling and such. Filial piety sometimes gets interpreted as ancestor worship. That's not actually correct. It's more of ancestor reverence. You are concerned and caring about your ancestors, whether they are living or dead. So while they're living, you make sure that they are taken care of and their needs are met and you are showing proper respect and so forth. But after they're gone, after they're dead, and they're in wherever they go, then they can reward you and they can punish you and they can affect what's going on right here in the earth. So by showing reverence to your ancestors, it can benefit you. So you might do something like set up a little shrine. Of course, in the days of photography, you would set up a picture and some sort of little offerings and shrine to that dead ancestor. Prior to that, you might have a drawing or perhaps some other thing that represents that person. So you need to follow the ways of the ancestor. That's part of your reverence, right? If you start doing things very differently than how they did it, you would be showing disrespect that you don't think they did things right. So essentially now we've got a society here during the Shang Dynasty that is looking for or practicing reverence for ancestors and not wanting to make any changes. They want to just keep doing things the way they are. They are looking to restore the harmony, the order, the interrelatedness of all things, this idea that was put forth in the Xie Kingdom. And so they say, here's one of the ways that we can get it. They also introduced something that had actually been around, but now it gets formalized in the Shang Dynasty. It's called divination, and you can call it fortune telling, divining the future, those kind of things. And there were many different techniques, and it was practiced in order to predict and interpret the natural events. You could also perhaps get influence or information from your ancestors. So one of the very earliest forms, they took bones, animal bones, I suppose sometimes human bones, and they would scratch into those bones the question or the desire, so maybe should I marry this person? So that would be scratched into the bone, and then the bones would be thrown into a fire. And depending on how the bones cracked and burned and split, you would get your answer. Now, you probably needed someone, a priest of some sort, to tell you what those cracks and splits mean, but it was a way to predict and get your answers back. You might ask your ancestors, is this a good person? Should I marry them? Or, should I plant crops over in this area? Whatever the question might be, you're trying to make life better. So you could use a little advice from someone who has absolute knowledge of what's going to happen. As far as religion goes, those are the things that we needed from the Shang Dynasty. The introduction of filial piety, the idea of no changes, and the practice of divination. We move in 1025 BCE from the Shang to the Zhou dynasty. In the Zhou dynasty, we get a stronger emphasis on Tian as a force, a cosmic force, and not a place. It becomes the source of natural and moral order. It is the right flow. It is the right thing. It is the right energy. It is the right action. It's the right everything. And it's essentially like a god, you could say. It's a deity. It is a cosmic force. It's not a person, so it's not a deity in that way. But it is the thing, the source of all that is right and good in the cosmos. So one of the things that the Zhou introduce is the idea of Tianming, or the mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven, Tianming, okay, says that the rulers rule because they have been given the mandate by heaven. In other words, because they have or do things properly, they have been given the authority or the right to rule. So an emperor is the ruler because he is following what heaven wants. Heaven gives him the mandate, the permission, you could say, to be the ruler. Now, as long as he continues to follow the flow of heaven and work in accordance with the flow of heaven, he will stay in power. If he starts to go against it, let's say he becomes corrupt or greedy or something, if he starts to go against the flow of heaven, what happens is the mandate will be withdrawn and he will be essentially taken out, which is exactly what happened to the one of the Zhou um, emperors in 769. So we're still here in the Zhou. In 769, when he was assassinated by dissidents. They didn't like what he was doing, and so they served as a kind of like an agent from heaven to take him out because he was doing the wrong thing. He was not a good lower, pardon me, a good leader. Two more things, though, that come out of the Zhou dynasty that fit according to the religion or add to the religion. One is the idea of the Tao. Now, the Tao is spelled sometimes T-A-O and sometimes D-A-O, but it is always pronounced like a D, the Tao. So the Tao is the path or the road, and it is the principle of cosmic harmony and order. And because of this path, which you need to discover, right? um, they began keeping very intense records. So what they wanted to do is understand the patterns of change that are the Tao, because within the Tao, this path or this road allows for change. So remember back in the Shang dynasty, it was like, oh, no change, can't change. It's disrespectful to the ancestors. In the Zhou dynasty, we get the idea that change is possible as long as it is change that's in accordance with the Tao. If you're following the right flow of heaven, change is okay. So what's the right flow? How do you know? One of the ways was to keep these records of everything. I mean, not just things like seasons and crops, but who married who and what babies were born and what sicknesses came through, those kind of things. And they were looking for patterns. Can they say, oh, this many years in a row we had drought, but then we had rain, and so they could look, oh, again, we had this many years of drought and now we have rain. And they were looking to be able to predict what the flow of heaven, or interpret the flow of heaven, so that they could follow it. They had one other thing that we care about, and that is the idea of the yin and the yang. So the yin and the yang are complementary opposites, and I'm willing to bet at least one of you out there has it tattooed on yourself somewhere. If not uh, on you, you know someone that does. This is that circle that looks to be split kind of unevenly. it's half black and half white. And then within the white part, there's a black dot, and in the black part, there's a white dot. And what this is symbolizing is balance. There are opposites in everything, and we need to have the right amount of balance. So the dark side would be the yin yang. So yin would be the dark side, it's the female side, it's considered earthly, it is cool, it is moist, it is winter. Whereas the white side or the yang side would be represent the male. It's bright, it's warm, it's dry, it's summertime, it's not earth, but it's heaven. And it is, again, the opposite of the other side. What's important to notice is that when you look at that circle and you're looking at the big kind of fish-shaped black part, it has a dot of white, and the white has a dot of black. That's important because it's saying to be completely consumed by one or the other is wrong. You're out of balance. Every dark has a little light in it, and every light has a little dark in it. So the idea here would be, again, coming out of the Zhou dynasty, would to be seeking a balance between the two. And so it's good to have a mix of both. It is bad to have an excess of either. So when you see people that are acting, too yin and there's no yang in there at all, okay, that's out of balance. Or if you have people who are too yang and have no yin in there, it's out of balance. Again, it's all about balance. So that is the end of the ideas that come out of the Zhou dynasty that we need, but we're not done yet with some history of China. So after the Zhou emperor was assassinated in 769, they move into the Warring States period. The Warring States period is the Warring States period is exactly that. It's all of the different small kingdoms or states within what we know as China fighting for control. It is a 500-year period where it is chaos, it is the opposite of harmony and order. And so their search for order and harmony intensifies. This period sometimes is just complete chaos, but right in the middle of it, in around 550 BCE, so the 6th century BCE, we have a time period called the Age of 100 Philosophers. So what happened in this 550-ish BCE, the Age of 100 Philosophers, is that a lot of people were spending time and effort and thought trying to figure out how do we restore harmony? How do we restore peace? Can we ever get back to, say, the Shay Kingdom? During that time, 550 BCE, if you'll remember, the Buddha was born. We also have the birth of the man that would go on to found Confucianism, and the birth of the legendary founder of Taoism. So three major religions all credited to this middle period in the Warring States period during this Age of 100 Philosophers. There was such an extreme focus all around the East trying to solve the problems. But what actually happened and what ended the Warring States period is that a man named Qin Shi Huangdi, who was a warlord, conquered all of China. So Qin Shi, so Qin, it's the Qin dynasty, Qin Shi Huangdi. He was a warlord, as I said, and he had a pretty clever plan that worked. He started with his state within the country we now know as China. By the way, the word China comes from Qin and the Qin dynasty. because he is the one who unified all of the warring states and gave us the empire of China that we know today. So Qin Shi Huangdi starts off with his empire, his smaller state, okay, and he begins to conquer the ones that are near him, and he does. And he eventually keeps spreading and spreading until he has circumferenced the entire area of what is now China. And then he moves in from the outside and conquers the inside, and now has the entire uh, area of China, and he is the ruler. So he is the first emperor of China. He is the first person to control all of what we now know as China. So a large, large kingdom. He declared the new Qin dynasty and ordered destruction of all non-practical and non-technical books. So he did not want people to read the works of the philosophers, including Confucius, because Confucius came about 300 years before Qin conquered China. He did not want them to read the Tao, same reason, they were about 300, 350 years prior to him. He didn't want people to be questioning some of the big questions that we tend to ask. What he wanted was people to have practical knowledge. He wanted them to understand how to grow crops and raise animals. He also set up a unified set of weights and measures and money, which facilitated trade within the country. And he was indeed bringing China up to some glory days. He began the Great Wall. So if we look at this, we're looking at the Great Wall in China is, 2,300 years old. There were, however, some problems. Yes, he brought order and harmony, but he was a very harsh ruler. He was despotic. He actually wound up conquering the other states around him to create China by mass murders in some cases. Any people who would not get on board with his plan were eliminated. Um, People who conflicted with him gave him any kind of grief. He would have them killed, or his armies would kill them. People in his upper cabinet who were advisors to him, if they conflicted with him, they would mysteriously die in their sleep, or just go disappeared. So again, his rule was not one that was what we might think of as a moral rule. He gained power through brutal methods. We also know a few things about him as a man. So we know that he was paranoid. In fact, one of the reasons he started the Great Wall was because he wanted to keep the Mongols from coming down into his new empire, and so he was constantly afraid of attack. He was also afraid of personal attack. So he did some things that we would look at and say are weird. Like he wouldn't cut his fingernails or toenails. And drawings of him show him as having those fingernails that get so long that they just kind of grow out and twist around, right? And he kept them because he didn't want anybody to get hold of any kind of fingernail or toenail cutting. He wouldn't cut his hair or his beard for the same reason, because people might be able to get those bits of him and use them um, to put a spell on him or harm him in some way. He also lived in the interior of a palace that was protected. So he lived essentially in this one lovely room, but it had one entrance, and that entrance led to a hallway which surrounded it. And then on the other side, there was the doorway that went out to another hallway. And then that went around and came around to another hallway. And there were several layers of these hallways, each with one door. And the reason he did that is he filled those hallways, they were large hallways, with troops. They actually lived in these hallways. And so before anyone could get to him, they would have to come in the original gate, fight their way through the hallway and all of these hundreds of soldiers, and get around to the other side where they would find another gate. Then they would have to get through that gate and fight their way all through those soldiers, and so on for 5 or 6 different layers of hallways. So it was an extreme battle to get to him. He did not want to be harmed. Obviously, he was afraid of it. Now, during his reign, he wanted to live forever. And so he got some of the Taoist priests who were practicing something called alchemy. Alchemy is basically the basics of chemistry. And they were trying to make elixirs that would give him long life or eternal life. The elixirs were a variety of things. I mean, the Taoist priests were mixing up all sorts of things. So they were like, oh, okay, well, here is mercury and cinnabar and some other elements, and drink that, right? Here's one, let's put arsenic, and basically they were trying all sorts of things to give Chen Shi Huangdi long life or eternal life. And the result is it killed him. So he was in control from 221 BCE to 207 BCE. So he died fairly young, and it was because of he was essentially being poisoned. But during his time, he not only started the Great Wall and what ultimately would become the Forbidden City, he started something that was his burial tomb. And it was remarkable. In fact, we recently discovered it. We, modern civilization, did not discover it until 1975. So you may have heard of the city of Xi'an and the terracotta soldiers. He's the one that had that done. What this is it's a burial mound, almost like a pyramid, but it's made out of earth or earthen bricks rather than hard baked bricks. And inside it were hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers that were made out of clay, terracotta, that were full life size. Each and every one of them was different than, the face was different. They had weapons, they had tools, and they were all standing in order, ready to fight. There were terracotta horses and chariots and you name it, all of these things that were created to protect the emperor in his afterlife. So when he died, he would still have a an army to command. And then that was buried under, again, a mound. But it's not where he was going to be buried. That was his army that was there. However, about a mile away, there was another mound that was built, one that we haven't opened yet. And that's the one that's supposed to be his burial space. And it was not an army. It was according to the legend, a beautiful area with a lake and streams and peacocks and trees, but it's underground. So what they did is they created this park-like atmosphere for him to live in when he's dead, for him to be in, and the water, so that it would shimmer like water and there was no sunlight, was actually a lake of mercury, which did shimmer. And the stream ran through the area, and what kept it in motion was that there were people that were underground living there who were on paddle wheels, and they would step on it and keep the paddles going, and that kept the stream going. So he had this lovely park, this lovely palace area. There were animals, there were deer, like I said, there were peacocks and monkeys and whatever was around in nature. It was there, along with people to serve him, along with women who were concubines, who were there to serve him, and he would be buried in there when he died, and the whole thing would be sealed up. And so, of course, any of the living things in there would die soon enough. The other big problem with that is that mercury is toxic. So breathing the fumes of mercury, certainly drinking mercury in an elixir can destroy your mind, make you crazy. It's probably part of why he was so extremely paranoid. It had been a lot of the mercury poisoning. So the two big mounds were not discovered. They were discovered by farmers in 1975 who were plowing the field and digging down and discovered the tomb of the terracotta soldiers. And the Chinese government, of course, got interested in that and started excavating. And over the years, it's been, 45 years now, they have uncovered hundreds, if not thousands, of these statues. They have found areas that were smaller burial areas that were actually filled with the bones of people, which was probably a graveyard for the workers. And they have been excavating, and they've been doing it for 45 years, and they still haven't finished excavating this building project or this army project that Qin Shi Huangdi had begun. The other mound, they realize now, is also not just a hill, because that's what people thought for the last 2,000 years. Oh, it's just a hill, right? Well, what happened is they realized that's the burial mound for Qinshi, but they don't want to go into it because the readings, even on the outside of the mound, right, for mercury are so high that they realize it would be very, very toxic to enter this. Secondly, it is the tomb of an emperor, the emperor who created the land of China. And so they don't want to defile his burial tomb. At some point they may, but for now we can't do much more than ground penetrating radar to see if there's something there, and there is, and then we can dig up the areas around it. And as they dig more and more, they are finding that this burial complex is bigger than they ever imagined. So that's the legacy of Qin Shi Huangdi. Anyway, he is the last of the emperors that we're really concerned about. Of course, after him, there was the Han Dynasty and so on, but they didn't contribute to the religions that we are going to study. So we are only concerned with religion, so we only need to look at these dynasties. The next segment, next video, will cover Confucianism and Taoism directly.